Good afternoon, everyone. Yes. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Auguste Kwame. I'm a director in IAG, and I would like to welcome you here on behalf of IAG to launch our report on engaging citizens for better development results. I would just like to use a couple of minutes, perhaps even less, to share with you how we're planning this event, and then we will we'll get started. So we will start with two videos where Sophie Certain, our acting Director General, will share with you the reason why we did this evaluation and what are the broad high-level findings. And then we'll also hear from Manuela Ferro, the OPCS Vice President, who will share with you some thoughts on the relevance for this of this evaluation for the work that the World Bank Group is doing. And then we'll hear from Elena Bardassi, who is the TTL for this evaluation. She will share with you a presentation in person here in the room on the main findings of the evaluations and its recommendations. And after that, we'll have a panel of very illustrious members and of the citizen engagement community here in the bank and outside the bank, as we like doing. And the panel will be moderated by Jeff Hall, who is a freelance consultant. So without much ado, let me ask our technical team to start us up with the videos. Okay, we're still waiting. Technology hopefully will not fail us. Okay, here we go.
Citizen engagement for better development results was produced in the context of the World Bank Group 2013-2014 strategic framework for mainstreaming citizen engagement in World Bank operations. But before talking about the goals, objectives, and content of the evaluation, let me say that it was prepared with a very constructive engagement with World Bank Group management, in particular the global practice SUR, social, urban, rural and resilience global practice, and the governance global practice, as well as the citizen engagement secretariat. It was also discussed and endorsed by the board's Committee on Development Effectiveness. Turning to the evaluation's objective and content now, let me highlight three main points. First, this evaluation was conceived with a very strong learning objective. The framework being quite new, 2013-2014, and the quantitative target being having been set for 2018, the end of the fiscal year, the evaluation did not cover the entire period of the strategic framework. Therefore, from an accountability perspective, it would not be fair to use the evaluation to assess whether the World Bank Group reached its target, although the evaluation points out to significant progress already towards the targets. By contrast, we believe that the evaluation brings a timely learning contribution to any potential review or update of the strategic framework's goals, approaches, or targets at the end of the 2018 period, which has now been reached. Second, despite the fact that this evaluation was conceived with this recent framework in mind, it does look at the wealth of World Bank Group projects and strategies and that have citizen engagement activities in them. Indeed, there is a long tradition of engaging citizens in the World Bank Group. It does that at project level, including investment loans and policy loans, and for the IFC with with regard to performance standard 1. It does it also at the level of country strategies and, of course, at institutional level, looking at the effectiveness of the Secretariat, but also the role of the GPSA, the Global Partnership for Social Accountability, and it looks at the relationship with other relevant related strategic priorities of the institution, such as gender or safeguards, obviously, or social inclusion. Therefore, the evaluation is based on a broad set of activities, of relevant activities, enhancing its robustness and credibility. Thirdly, the evaluation was conceived with a very clear forward-looking objective. It does highlight some very positive and very impressive achievements of the World Bank Group in mainstreaming citizen engagement, including achieving a change in culture towards mainstreaming such type of activities, which for those who know about change management would know that it's often one of the most difficult but also most relevant change to achieve sustainable impact. At the same time, the evaluation points to opportunities that the bank can seize to enhance the effectiveness of its citizen engagement activities towards greater impact, towards better service quality, service delivery, and other development outcome. Ultimately, the evaluation points to trades-off between the use of quantitative targets versus quality, more qualitative requirements, and of course the use of resources devoted to the effort. So we hope that this evaluation will provide food for thought to World Bank Group management and shareholders as they define the new agenda following the 2018 strategic framework.
So let me start by saying that the citizen engagement for the bank is extremely important. It's a key element of our effectiveness, of our design of operations that meet citizens' needs, of our transparency, and more importantly, of our sustainability. So we have for a while actually focused on the importance of citizen engagement, and perhaps started more prominently with Wolfenson, with President Wolfenson. And at that time, he set out a framework for engaging with citizens. That was deepened under President Zellick. And then in 2015, President Kim issued a number of commitments, including that we would embed 100% citizen feedback in the preparation of IPFs, of operations that obviously are suitable for identifying the beneficiaries. And we've started doing that. We set up a set of mechanisms to embed citizen feedback in our operations, in IPFs. What this report shows, this evaluation shows, is that management made a very significant effort to do that in all the IPFs. Now, going forward, what we will intend to do is actually to embed that also in supervision, not just in the preparation, but during implementation when it's most important. We are also broadening the agenda. It is very good if our projects are informed by citizens' views and perspectives. But it's even more important if not only our projects, the ones we finance, but all activities of government in developing countries and developed world are informed by citizens' perspectives. So we think that the big potential, the big payoff in this agenda is to embed citizen feedback in budget preparation, in budget execution, in policy reform, in, of course, investment operations, regardless of whether they're financed by us or by others, or by the governments themselves, by their own resources. But at the end of the day, of course, we are pleased with the findings of these report. We don't want to rest on these findings, which are positive, but we know there's more to be done. But we also want to see the more systemic agenda where we can really do this at scale in developing countries.
This is a nice segue to the presentation of the report by Elena Bardassi, TTL of the evaluation, and hopefully she will share with us what else can be done, as Manuela was saying, what can be done to do better.
Thank you, Auguste. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Good afternoon. Your presence here, you are so many, confirms that this is really an important part of the agenda, engaging citizens. You know, when we were doing this evaluation, we visited a little village in Ethiopia, north of Addis Ababa, where there is a World Bank project that brings together the citizens, the service providers, and the local authorities to discuss local budgets and the needs and priorities of the community. And a villager, a person, came to us and said, you know, in these meetings, when we realized how little resources they arrive here, trickle down to the local level, we decided to tax ourselves and to make resources available to fix the road. So this strikes me because it's a nice example of how engagement can change behaviors. Even when this was not required in the project, it really had an impact and strengthened the results of the project. So I'm here today to present some of the main findings of our evaluation, engaging citizens for better development results. In a nutshell, what we find in this report is that the bank did great progress in implementing this agenda, and to step up to the next level, it needs to deepen the quality of this engagement. So, the citizen wants to participate. They expect to participate. They want to define their development goals, as it happened with the SDGs. They want to hold their governments accountable. They expect to be involved in the implementation of the bank projects. And also, the development institutions, such as the World Bank Group, they realize that they need to move from a top-down approach to more of a demand-driven and a bottom-up approach, where the citizens have a critical role and are partners in development. So the World Bank has engaged with citizens for a long time. There are many entry points for engaging with citizens. In 2014, it has adopted a strategic framework for engaging with citizens that brings together under a common architecture all these various entry points with a vision and with a set of principles. And it also made a new commitment to make sure that 100% of our projects includes mechanism for engaging with citizens, and that we also use in results frameworks indicators to measure the results of this engagement. Around the same time that the strategic framework was prepared, there were also other initiatives in our institution that further strengthen this willingness, this commitment of the bank of making the citizen more central in the bank's effort. For example, we had the new country engagement models that was introduced. We had the release of the World Development Report on governance and the law. We had more recently the reformed environmental and social framework. So all these initiatives emphasize the role that citizens have to have in the development process. So is the bank group doing a good job in engaging citizens? So this is the central question of our evaluation that wants to assess the effectiveness of the World Bank Group in engaging with citizens. And today I will focus I will focus on the findings for the bank, although the evaluation also includes IFC, and I will guide you through 3 main sets of findings that support the 5 recommendations that we give to the institution. So finding number 1. There was indeed great progress that the bank did in embracing this agenda. What we found was at all levels, managers and staff embracing this agenda, understanding that engaging citizens is a critical piece of our projects, and the question is not anymore if, but how. We also observed that more projects indeed include citizen engagement mechanisms, especially those that are not mandated by safeguards that were already required at the start. And also that there are more indicators in the result frameworks that track the results of this mechanism. The second finding is about the quality and depth of this engagement. The bank has identified all the right elements for a good engagement. The strategic framework is very clear on this. An engagement to be effective, to be transformational, has to be continuous, has to use multiple tools. It has to reach out to a diverse group of citizens. It has to be inclusive. And it also works better when this mechanisms are actually integrated in country systems, like Manuela Ferro was saying before, in order to increase the accountability of governments. In our fieldwork, we actually observe some of good examples. In the Dominican Republic, conditional cash transfer program, for example, citizens can use report cards to channel their complaints about services. And what works well in this case is that there is a very clear and established system for citizens to present their complaints, but also a very well-defined and established system for service providers to provide a response to those complaints. So when the two come together, this is where change can happen. However, this is not the norm. So what the evaluation found is that in many cases, engagement is limited. It's perhaps a small activity that dies when the project closes. It's not very clear who was involved and what results were achieved. So it is not possible to expect deep engagement in every project. So what the bank hasn't done is to recognize that there is actually a trade-off between quantity and quality. And this needs to be recognized explicitly and be addressed. The third set of findings are about the enabling environment. All what we need, the resources, the infrastructure to make this happen. When the bank makes a corporate commitment, every corporate commitment, the risk is that there might be, this check-the-box attitude that creeps in. And for this reason, resources, support, incentives need to be provided in order to make sure that the teams embrace the commitment and in a substantial way to avoid this mechanical implementation of the commitment. The bank did indeed do a good job in mobilizing skills, especially the regional level, especially focal point that are helping operational team to integrate these activities in their work. It also created a citizen engagement secretariat that is mostly focusing or largely focusing on ensuring compliance, which is an important piece. But some other elements are left out or not as strong as they could be. For example, quality is not well monitored. There is not an explicit strategy to seize the opportunities where a deep engagement can happen. There hasn't been not enough investment in knowledge management and in training for the internal staff and the clients as well. And also, there are other agendas in the bank that are important, like gender, inclusion, and the new environmental and social framework that offer opportunities for synergies that haven't been exploited yet. So, based on these findings, IG has formulated 5 recommendations. The first recommendation is about including quality more prominently among the corporate priorities going forward, as quality as an essential element for achieving development results. This has to become a much more prominent element in the next corporate commitment formulation. The second recommendation is about promoting deep engagement. And the recommendation highlights how this can be achieved by supporting the regions, the countries, and the GPs in creating tools and approaches that are perhaps region-specific, country-specific, but are tailored to the needs of the clients at the local level. The third recommendation is about improving monitoring in order to understand what works, where and why. We need to move from process-oriented indicators, which are important, to more results-oriented indicators that can tell us which type of change is actually happening on the ground. The fourth recommendation is about linking more closely the citizen engagement and the environmental and social framework that has just been reformed. The ESF, the new ESF, is moving safeguards from a more traditional risk management approach to a more proactive approach. And so the gap between this agenda and the citizen engagement agenda is shrinking. And it makes sense to link more closely these two agendas from a substantial and an efficiency standpoint. So if the bank acts on this recommendation and increases the depth and quality of its engagement, it can move up to the next step where engagement, is more ambitious and more transformational. So as you think of questions for the panel, perhaps you might think also of some ideas that you might have to implement this recommendation. So this is just a flavor of, there is a fifth recommendation. I was missing it because I didn't talk about IFC in this presentation, but there is a fifth recommendation. IFC, as Sophie was saying, is using the performance standards as an entry point for engagement. And our recommendation requires IFC to support better the clients to implement stakeholder engagement with the communities where they operate and to improve the tracking of this effort. So this is just a flavor of our findings. I invite you to go online to download the report, to read it. You'll find many more findings and many more examples of our evaluation. And with that, I leave it to Jeff Hall to kick off the panel discussion. Thank you.
To come up here. Apparently we have some empty seats you can use. Is that right, Javier? Yeah. Okay, so thanks for coming here today, everybody. I guess I'm going to go ahead and welcome our panel up. We have Nadia Dar. She's the head of the Washington, D.C. office for Oxfam International. Welcome, Nadia. We have Ere Jorge Hijas Vasquez. He is the Senior Director for GP SUR, that's the Social, Urban, Rural, and Resilience Global Practice here at the bank. Anna Wettenberg, she's a Senior Social Scientist from RTI International. She also manages RTI Press. Welcome, Anna. And is Debbie here? Yeah. Debbie, welcome. Looks like the board let her go. So we have Debbie Wetzel. She's the Senior Director for the Governance Global Practice here at the bank. She and Ede share leadership for the citizen engagement agenda. So welcome to you all. We are going to build a citizen engagement sandwich here today. We'll end with an opportunity for you all to engage, our citizens in the audience there, by opening it up to questions. And you can also submit your questions online if you're following us on the live stream. The address you go to is www.polev.com/IEG now. And I think it's not up there. But anyway, so did everybody get that? It's www.polev.com/IEG now. So, like I said, we'll have a little citizen engagement sandwich here. And so before we get started, let's do a little engagement with our citizens. And I'd just like to ask, how many people here are from the bank? Okay. And from the bank, who's from GP SUR? And the Governance Global Practice? Excellent. And how many people here have worked on a project that incorporates citizen engagement mechanisms? Okay, great. So we have folks who know what's going on here, I think. Civil society? Excellent. And academia? Aha. One brave academic there in the back. So that's wonderful. And how many people have read the IEG report? All right. Did you see that, Elena? That's amazing, isn't it? For those of you who haven't, I would urge you to download it. It makes a great stocking stuffer. Curl up by the fire with a cup of hot cocoa and an IEG report. There's nothing better over the holiday, as Elena will tell you. Sorry? Just to be clear, what we just did does not qualify as citizen engagement under the bank's definition. But we do know that there is a risk that this citizen engagement agenda can just become a box to tick. I've been hearing this phrase box to tick since the strategy was announced. And this is one of the main findings of the IEG report, is that there is that risk. And in fact, we saw from the report that 65% of World Bank staff said that their managers either didn't care about citizen engagement or were driven only by the compliance function. So there's something wrong with the incentives here. And I want to just kick it off by asking you, Debbie, lucky you, what are the essential steps that the bank needs to take to deepen the quality of citizen engagement and its activities, and to think more strategically about citizen engagement at the country level?
So first off, I just want to note and thank Ede, because we get a lot of heat as GPs because everybody says we work in silos. And this is one case where Ede and I and Asmin and Maninder are almost Siamese twins. I mean, we pretty much do a lot, and so it's been a great partnership. Ede has exercised great leadership. Our teams have worked together extremely closely. So just for the record, I'd like to, often we bring out the negative when we talk about country evaluations and thematic evaluations. And this is one area where different GPs across the bank are working together very closely, albeit on different parts of the agenda. So the part of the agenda that the governance practice is meant to oversee relates to Jeff's question, which is how do we incentivize citizen engagement more broadly across countries, not so much in the project sphere, but in the how do we get it to happen, whether it's in a CPF or some tool that the bank uses, or for the government to do it itself. We have lots of tools that we use in order to do this, whether it's in a development policy loan where we ask them to implement a particular prior action that has to do with citizen engagement or access to information that citizens can then draw on, whether it is in a institutional investment loan dealing with opening up procurement, as was the case in Bangladesh. We have a lot of partnerships. We have the Open Government Partnership. We have the Global Partnership for Social Accountability. The Global Partnership for Social Accountability works with CSOs on the ground to help them to build the capacities and the tools to be able to understand and respond to data and information that is out there and exists. The Open Governance Partnership works with countries who put forward commitments about how they want to be open, how they want to engage with citizens, et cetera. So lots and lots of tools. But the real question becomes, it comes down to a couple things that Elena mentioned, which is, what do we mean by thick? What do we mean by quality? And really what we are trying to work on in the governance practice is a two-way interaction between citizens and governments in all sorts of different spheres and all sorts of different products that embodies a couple of things. So the first is citizens getting information and having an incentive and the trust to give feedback on it that they feel will be heard, that they feel will get some kind of response, and frankly, that they feel makes a difference. And what we see all around the world is that trust in government is collapsing. Citizens are not sure about whether their governments are really looking after them or not. And this is not only limited to developing countries, we see it in developed countries. And so one of our jobs is to try to think through how can we bolster the capacity and the ability of CSOs across the board to be able to have the tools they need, the knowledge they need, the information they need to be able to interact with governments. And on the other hand, we also need governments that have enough confidence to be able to go out and interact with citizens and not freak out, basically. That if they're going to get criticism or if they're going to, that they have a capacity to take that information and do something with it. And so an important part of the thickening, whether you use cornstarch or whatever particular type of food product the thickening involves dialogue between the two, but it also involves a sense of understanding and expectations of what can arise from the engagement. So I think one of the things we need to think about both in projects and more broadly speaking is CSOs may arrive and say, okay, here we are, we're going to change the world. We're going to change the budget. They need to understand what parameters within which they can affect change. Governments need to hear that, and another bit of jargon, they need to close the feedback loop. So when they hear something, they also need to reach out back to CSOs to be able to say, we heard you, this is what we could accommodate, this is what we couldn't. And so the work of the governance practice is trying to affect those changes in a whole variety of different ways with a whole variety of different tools. And hopefully those are things that help benefit the work we do at the project level as well. So let me stop there. But
that's great. Thanks, Debbie.
Starting point.
So it sounds like from what you said, in some ways, the bank is a broker for this agenda. You mentioned civil society and government and the bank, and that for a project to be successful, everybody really needs to come together. And I know that the bank has said that citizen engagement is crucial to the achievement of the twin goals. IEG report seems to show that staff agrees. Something like 87% said that it's crucial to the achievement of development outcomes. Yet we know that this brokering role, bringing communities and government together, is increasingly difficult. Civicus tells us that 111 out of 196 governments have closing civic space. How much is this the World Bank's problem, Ede?
Well, look, it is a problem because if we really want to work with countries to make sure that the projects are implemented and achieve their objectives, then not having a structured engagement with citizens and stakeholders is such a tremendous blockage to achieving those things. So it is our problem. We can have projects and investments and activities in countries where the likelihood of achieving the development objective is reduced because there's no that. Now, what happened with the approval of the environmental and social framework is that it actually raises even the profile of stakeholder engagement. It raises. It's not only guidelines and this is our goals and all that. This is a policy. Okay, so this is not something that we can kind of go around, and therefore it's the most exciting thing that we have in front of us, because it gives the space and the guidance and the messages that a stakeholder and a stakeholder look at the environmental and social framework. Stakeholder is not people affected by the projects, but people who are also interested in the project, and therefore we have a new framework that allows us to do that. So it's not something nice to do, something that we have to do, but on top of that, the achievement of those development objectives needs to be into this process. Now, is it easy? No, it's not easy, and it's getting increasingly difficult, as you say, and that's where but that's part of the development challenges. That's what makes it important into this process, and that's why this kind of reports and this kind of initiatives and this continuous process to say and to bring the evidence, and that's why the monitoring and evaluation of what we have work on is right now so important, and IG highlighted. Right now, what we have are hundreds and hundreds of projects that have citizen engagement mechanisms embedded. And I think that this is one of the largest laboratories. I think it's one of the largest laboratories to understand citizen engagement mechanism globally. 3-5 years down the road, I look forward to the next evaluation from IG to say what is coming out of that process. And the learning and the connecting this country is going to be so important, because we do need even a stronger evidence of the intuition that we have. Citizen engagement is important for the development objective of projects. It's important for having institutions that are more effective. How to go about it, we're going to be getting all this evidence out of that. We're going to get a lot of failures out of that no question about it. And therefore, seriously, we have what I think is the most interesting platform and laboratory to learn what makes sense. Now, that's not going to change every government out of the 115 that are closing their doors, but it will bring evidence on the table that allows us to sound less dogmatic, that allows us to say, look, this is the reality into this process, and to have windows of opportunity to try to find champions in governments who say, this is important. Now, it's also an issue that the governments is not only that they want to close themselves. Even the most open of public officials get scared on this. Or my career, I work with clients who say, we understand, but this is scary. And we had a project of an urban transport project in Latin America, and we set up a citizen engagement platform, and over the first month, like more than 10,000 complaints came in. I'm telling you, the manager of that, the Institute of Transport of that city was really scared. And my vice president was really scared. They said, this project is a disaster. We had 10,000 complaints. And actually I said, it's not a disaster. You now know 10,000 complaints that you can fix. This is the basis to have a successful project. 10,000 complaints under the rug that nobody knows about. I'm telling you, that's a failure. That's the problem. But it's scary. And it's really scary. And I think that this process of this laboratory, this platform, this learning, and that's why we embrace the message from IG that we need to do a monitoring evaluation in a very structured manner, a lot more knowledge management. This is going to help us. And hopefully the development community, because this is not only for us, but the development community, to understand how important is citizen and stakeholder engagement in the development arena.
Great, thanks. And I guess I wonder, it's one thing to bring evidence to government and sort of make the case from this sort of development effectiveness angle, but in other cases, it's going to require the bank to expend political capital. I mean, there are a million things on the agenda of the project implementation unit, and I guess I wonder, is the bank ready to spend political capital on this agenda? Either one, y'all are welcome to jump in.
Yes. So, as country director in Brazil, I spent an enormous amount of time interacting with CSOs, both international and local. I think the thing that needs to be taken into account is there are many, many, many agendas, many, many citizens and stakeholders in CSO that each represent one of those. And so the question and the thing we need to think about in an angle that's important for follow-up on the report is how do we work with CMUs, which is so country management units for those not in the bank. And they are typically the focal point for thinking through, okay, how do we make trade-offs and priorities in the work that we do? How do we effectively communicate that to the CSOs that we engage with so that they hear back, well, here's what we've decided to do, and here's why we may not have done exactly what you wanted. But in the political economy of what's needed, we're already doing that in different ways, shapes, and forms in advancing our programs. And then the question is, how do you manage to do it specifically for each of the projects and aggregate that up and make it more systemic so that the countries cotton on and say, hey, this is not such a bad idea. Maybe this is something we could use too as a tool to help get better implementation of what we're trying to do.
Great.
And if I may jump in, this is where we also need civil society as part of the conversation and engagement. Now, a couple of things. This is not just trying to convince governments, but remember that sometimes even in communities, stakeholder engagement is difficult in the sense that sometimes there's enough elite capture. Sometimes there's traditions where women will not be able to be part of that process. So opening up doors and making a stakeholder engagement is difficult at many, many different levels. And I think that that's the savviness, that's the astuteness, this is the ability of our project managers and our project teams around the world to try to understand what is the appropriate cultural, institutional, and political economy angle to be able to open up those spaces for that process. So the bank tends to be an institution obsessed about data evidence, but it's also about that savviness of the local conditions. And again, it's not only changing the mindsets of governments, but it's also a change of the mindset sometimes of communities and all that process. The good thing also, and I'm coming back to the environmental and social framework, is that one of the basic principles that now we're having there is the principle of inclusiveness. And coming and saying, look, there are excluded communities that need to be an important part of this stakeholder engagement. And this is going to be a fascinating challenge to be able to know how do you bring people with disabilities, how do you bring indigenous peoples, how do you bring the women within the indigenous peoples, how do you bring the LGBTI members of an indigenous community process who are excluded within that. So the frontiers of what we are coming in are really difficult, and we need all of you here who are from external NGOs and civil society and the like, and researchers. We are going to need your help a lot into opening up these new frontiers of engagement.
Great, thank you, Ede. Now I want to turn over to civil society and ask you, Nadia. I mean, it sounds from Ede and Debbie that the bank is deepening its commitment in this area. We've heard some commitments from the bank that are similar to this, going back to the participation source book of the 1980s, and Oxfam's been watching this for decades. I guess I wonder, what do you think are the next steps that the bank needs to take following the IEG reports to demonstrate that sort of commitment?
Right. Thanks. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the excellent IEG report, which was a great read. And also, yes, like Jeff said, could make a good stocking stuffer. So let me start by saying also where I think the bank has come. And I think that it's sort of good to take that historical perspective that Elena also talked about with Wolfenson, really opening up space at the World Bank for civil society and for citizens to be engaged in bank operations and discussions. But I think if I were to think about some of the key highlights over the years, the citizen engagement strategy and the framework for citizen engagement was actually a great step forward for the bank to actually have that and to sort of formalize the idea that citizen engagement is a fundamental part of the bank's work. The access to information policy in 2009 that became effective in 2010, that was a milestone, and it is remaining as a gold standard for development institutions and for countries. The presumption of disclosure was a huge shift in mentality and thinking about what information should be available to communities, and only with that information can they actually participate effectively. Accountability. Again, the bank has an amazing history with accountability. The first accountability mechanism, independent accountability mechanism of any development institution was here at the World Bank with the inspection panel. That's an amazing piece of history that you have here, and that's all part of the citizen engagement agenda. And that's also why it's so important to keeping up with those standards and making sure that those mechanisms are up to date and modernized. And then another one that I want to touch on is something that has already been mentioned, and that is the stakeholder engagement environmental and social standard in this new environmental and social framework. That's amazing and huge that that now exists as part of the safeguards. It is recognizing that this is not just something that we can add in a footnote or in a line. It has its own dedicated standard, and I think that that was a great thing that the bank did. I think there's a lot to do with respect to implementation of all of these things, including on ESS 10, where we're just starting to see how it's going to be rolled out, and I'm interested to see how that goes. Just another one to mention is the Global Partnership for Social Accountability. You mentioned it also. That's another very important way, not necessarily in bank operations, but it is a bank mechanism to support civil society to be holding different actors accountable. And I would encourage us to think about how to use GPSA also in terms, linking that better to bank operations. How can we use GPSA as part of the bank's own thinking around stakeholder engagement in its own operations? So then just thinking about, what do we do with this moving forward? How do we get to that deeper, more quality engagement that we've been talking about, and what are the next steps? I really do, I can't emphasize enough that I think a big part of this still comes down to who the client is and the client challenge that the IAG identified, and that we think about a lot is, the importance for the bank staff, bank contractors, and then the governments that you're interacting with to constantly reflect on who the ultimate client is. Who is this project for if it's not for these citizens that the government is so scared of engaging, and that TTLs are thinking about, where are my resources to engage in this process that you so clearly want us to do based on this new framework. If we really, really think about the communities and people as the ultimate client, I think that a lot of the other shortcomings also identified can be addressed. I think it is a fundamental part of the question, and the bank's own Shanta Devarajan, I'm going to read it, said it way more eloquently than me earlier this summer, if you guys remember. He said, the clients are the poor people in the country. The government and private sector is your intermediary. You are working with the government as a way to help the poor people in the country. They are the ultimate beneficiaries. And so that's, I think, fundamental as part of this. And I also want to emphasize the importance of thinking about what role the bank should be playing to promote and to protect civic space that is shrinking on a very frightening level in several countries that the bank is operating in. So just quick points. What are some of the quick things? They're not quick things at all. But what are some of these points to do? So first, I would say a zero-tolerance policy on reprisals, laying out clear consequences for your government. I don't want to call them client because it defeats my earlier point. But the governments that you are working with, having a zero-tolerance, when there are reprisals or a threat for reprisals against civil society. And it links to that issue on trust. I mean, we can't hide behind the fact that, the economy does not work for so many people. The economy in so many countries, globally, the economic system is not working for so many of these vulnerable communities. And so, when we think about trust, there is no trust because they haven't seen an economic model and system that's working for them. So we really have to build that trust, and the bank has to show whose side they're on and be there. So stand up for those clients. I would love to see the bank come up with a strong action plan to implement IAG's recommendations, and making that plan open for civil society to comment on would be stakeholder engagement implemented well, I think. I would say don't think about these mechanisms as separate, and I think the IAG report also did a good job of showing that we have to think about stakeholder engagement, the new ESF as part of this, accountability as part of this, transparency as part of this, GPSA as part of this. All of it is part of citizen engagement. And the third area is on capacity. It was identified as a major constraint in the IAG report on several levels. And capacity of the governments and also capacity of the civil society and communities that you're trying to engage who may not know how to engage effectively. Part of this is about ensuring there are budgets available to do this kind of work. Part of it is also not just about training, it's about making materials more accessible, processes more predictable for communities to engage, managing expectations appropriately. What can I use this grievance, project grievance level mechanism for versus what is this other accountability mechanism? All of these things are important for predictability for engagement, and that's a way of building capacity as well. And then finally, I'm interested in having a serious discussion about how to reform bank incentives to align with this commitment to citizen engagement. I'm really curious. I don't know if I'm allowed as a non-moderator on this panel to throw that question, but I really am curious. What are the discussions happening at the bank around incentives for staff to do quality citizen engagement?
So before we move into that, I want to give you all a chance to respond. But before we do, I wanted to move over to Anna. And we hear a lot that context matters for this agenda, and I know this is something that is important to you as well. I just ask you to reflect a little bit about how you see context mattering for the bank as an actor, and any recommendations that you think are particularly important for the bank to bear in mind going forward.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, I think one of the main issues around context is understanding how it can influence long-term engagement, which of course is critical for building buy-in and demonstrating how citizen engagement can work. As you mentioned, a lot of these countries, there's not a willingness to engage with citizens. There's a fear within the bank or within the countries for engaging with citizens. And so understanding what the context is, how the context is changing, is critical for that kind of long-term engagement. I think one of the really good examples of how you can engage in the long term while being sensitive to context is the Kecamatan Development Program, which was a World Bank program that started in Indonesia in the late 1990s under the autocratic Suharto regime, and was billed at that point as a poverty alleviation program. Over the years, that program, as Indonesia's priorities changed, as the political environment changed, that program adapted to the context while always insisting on citizen engagement principles. It was the same model of participation, transparency, and accountability, working with communities and citizens to identify priorities and select them and fund them or implement them themselves. But as the context changed, the program also changed. And by doing that, for example, when Suharto fell, the project to appeal to democratic reformers by reframing itself as an empowerment program. That wasn't possible under Suharto. It was always an empowerment and poverty program, but it was when the context changed, the program changed with it. Later on, when stunting and wasting became a big issue in Indonesia, the program developed a different model that still insisted on the same citizen engagement principles, but worked with poor communities to help improve health and nutrition. So over the years, as the program grew in different areas, in urban areas and rural areas, responding to different priorities in the context, that built relationships, that built a demonstration of how citizen engagement can be effective to address different kinds of development challenges. So eventually it became a national program, and in 2014 the principles of the program were enshrined in the law in Indonesia, in the village law. So that's one way of one really important illustration of how adapting to the context can help build the relationships, build the buy-in, demonstrate the effectiveness of citizen engagement over time.
Great, thank you. And I think that's a really good sort of segue into asking Debbie and Ede to respond to some of these questions, because this question that Nadia raised is one that we kick around within civil society quite a bit, which is, who is the client for the bank? And does it matter if a government isn't representative of its people? The way that you answer that question, does it change your answer at all? And then second, do you want to speak to the incentives around moving the citizen engagement agenda forward?
I'll do who is the client and you do incentives, okay? That sounds good. So there are many clients. So thinking that there's just one is too simplistic. Our shareholders are the governments, and they determine what we do. Our real client is the poor. And so we talk a lot. I'll do another plug for the WDR 2017. I do it all the time. About power and power relationships. That applies in countries. And it is a very serious consideration that we think about all the time. The point that you raised, Nadia, is like zero tolerance for reprisals. And so you think through, you say, okay, zero tolerance for reprisals. You're in a country, they have a reprisal, you walk away, say, we're not going to work with you. You're done.
In a bank project, though.
No, well, so certainly in a bank project that narrows it down a little bit. You can close the project, you can cancel it, you have some ways to affect change. And so I think our ability is partly the stakeholder analysis, but our ability to assess and look and see where entry points are, where we can make a difference, where we can advance an agenda. So this ties in a little bit to Anna's comments. The context changes all the time. And so our ability to understand how governments are changing, how people are changing, how needs are changing, it comes down a little bit to this question of what being thick in a good sense is, not a bad sense, of identifying how things are moving and the agility and the adaptiveness that we have to be able to respond to that. And I'll segue into the incentives bit. In some sense, we have some tools that are less adaptable than others. So our traditional investment loans, you set them up, they have particular contracts, and changing those, changing the goals, changing the tools, even, dare I say it, the way we evaluate these things really locks us in terms of what we're trying to accomplish and prevents us maybe from being as adaptable as we would like. Whereas other tools give us a little bit more flexibility in order to be able to do that. So just as our countries are complex, the relationships we have with them are complex, and that's something we need to take into account as we think about how really to get the most effective implementation we can for the poor. So, so I align with Shanta on that, but there's a world within which that operates.
Okay, so look, I tend to be a little bit of a contrarian inside the institution, so I may not be speaking for everybody, but I tend to think that there are two things that make the institution move in the right direction. First, clarity on the direction and targets. So when President Kim came in the spring meetings of, what was that, 2014, 2015? 13, and said, okay, look, it's clear that we need to engage with citizens. We commit 100% by FY18, FY17 of all this. To tell you the truth, that day, Manindra and I were like, what? How are we going to get there? I'm like, and to tell you the truth, between us, okay, no tweeting, we didn't think we were going to make it. I mean, it wasn't, imagine, you are there, you have direction, and you have 3 years to make sure that every project where you can identify citizen and investment projects will have this mechanism. I mean, this was a gargantuan project, like my son said, this is gargantuan. And therefore, I think that the institution, and at the beginning, as every institution, is like, how do we do this? How do we process this and that process? And then how do we began to look at all these pockets of excellence that we had around the institution, and how do we start making sure that people know about them? How do we make a secretariat that starts monitoring? How do we get that process? And the second dimension of incentives is that how do you make it easy for the project manager to achieve those targets? And therefore, how do you lower the disincentives? Meaning, how do you make sure that the staff that are in these teams know what is it that needs to be done? How do you very quickly have information sharing across? How do you, in very practical ways, allow people to start taking those steps in that direction? And that's what the incentives are all about. About lowering these incentives, lowering the barriers to achieve those targets. Because what you have is, and the only way we were able to achieve the 100% was by trust managers all around saying, this is exciting, this is interesting, by having team members that tell you this is how we can achieve it. Okay. Now, we also knew that the achievement of 100% was that, look, in many cases, you don't have enough experience to be able to have, with hindsight, what could have been better approaches to do that process. But that's what I mean by having the best laboratory and the best platform to start learning as we move in this project from project design in our appraisal documents to actual implementation to start extracting that process. And that's where the knowledge community, the community of practitioners into the topic becomes so important, the sharing of information, the capacity building, the training inside the organization and outside, and it's the extraction of the lessons out of that portfolio that it's going to make. So I think that the clarity of the target and the lowering of the difficulties is the balance to make sure that that happens. With the ESF raising this to a standard that is part of our policies, it even raises the commitment and the signal and the process to say, look, we need to start making sure that we work into this. And that's when all of the initial lessons of all this citizen engagement process will be fundamental to make sure that the quality of these first stakeholder engagement plans, and this is where we need all of you to look at them and see how can we improve, how do we make sure, and the knowledge management system that we're building around that process, we can collectively strengthen that direction. So I think that that's my sense of how the institution best operates into this process, and that's where we are. Achieving 100%, well, close to 100%, was actually something that, to tell you the truth, we didn't even believe that was going to happen, and it has happened, and now we have a machinery that is moving into this process. And learning from that is going to be a critical part of lowering the disincentives moving forward.
Great. Thank you, Ede. So I think it's about time to turn over to our second half of our citizen engagement sandwich here. Just go ahead and get your questions ready. And while we do, we'll take a question from Twitter or from the internet. And one that came up a couple of times here, I see it on the screen there, is how can citizen engagement be linked up to country systems to enhance accountability? And in particular, are there some opportunities in the country partnership frameworks, those are the bank strategies at the country level, or in the systematic country diagnostics to make sure that that happens? And I don't know, Nadia, do you have thoughts on that? Because I know Oxfam has done some work on CPFs and SCDs.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Maybe I'll tackle that last part of it. And I think one of the areas that we've been pushing the bank on for a while and trying to, think through together, I think, is how can you use the systematic country diagnostic moment, so the moment where you're actually looking at the barriers and opportunities for development in a country, to also simultaneously assess the space for citizens to engage. So it's looking at that civic space issue again. But it would be sort of a systematic look at what are the constraints and opportunities available in a given country for citizens to interact with the government throughout this next 4 to 6 year period, and with the bank as it's engaging in the country. And I think it really is a critical moment and a good opportunity to do that. And so I hope that we will see that moving forward.
Great. Did you want to add something, Debbie, very
I do,
quickly?
real quick. So just, we have in many cases, so Nepal is a good example of where we went out in many different ways, shapes, and forms. So we did the traditional invite people to a session to give their views, but we also used technology, so Facebook and reaching out. So more people were contacted in that, the creation of that strategy than ever before. And just to note that in our guidance to the SCD work that gets done, we have included framing and guidance on this thinking through both power balances, governance, and as part of the WDR 2017 story is this whole question of who's at the table, who's included, how can you increase inclusion, and so what we see is SCDs taking this up. I think it's hard for them to go out 4 to 6 years to say, here's what the plan is going to be, because you don't, in any given country, at most, your horizon that you can really think about specifics is 2 years or so. But just getting the ball rolling and framing it and saying, here's where we see the core issues, and getting a little bit more specificity about how you might approach things beyond the, governance is a cross-cutting issue, which is what often happens. So.
Great. And I think you wanted to jump in, yeah?
But quickly, just to jump and building on that, because
very quickly, Eddie, thank you.
Super quickly. No, but because I think that on the country systems, let's not think that country system is this general countrywide issue, but it's really a transformation of institutions also that begin to realize through BAM projects that, hey, this is really cool. It makes sense for us. It makes us a better institution, and therefore their institutional system begins to incorporate, and then the institution as a whole become. And then you have pockets of excellence in a country that begins to influence the country system. So not only from the top down, but also from the institution up, it's an important opportunity.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. I was just going to say, I think I was agreeing with you, Debbie, that I think 4 to 6 years is going to give too static a perspective, because if these are countries that have a lot of change, like Nepal, where there's been just turbulence continuously, 4 to 6, that could be a great starting point, but reassess over time. And then my other point was going to be related to what you said. I think it's really critical to not only think at the national level, start there, look at different levels, but then over time, see where the opportunities emerge to change incentives for local governments and for service providers at the very local level, not only their capacity, but how are you changing their incentives to engage with citizens, because that's where you're going to get the real institutionalization, where you get face-to-face interaction between state actors and civil society.
Great, thank you, Anna. And
I want to add a quick
Sorry, we're taking over.
Sorry, Jeff. We're going to
crowding out our citizens.
Just a point in terms of the shrinking civic space. So what we see around the world, that the place where you could get traction when at the top end things are shutting down is at the local level. And that holds in the U.S. as well as around the world. So we see really interesting things happening below. And so through the work that we do at the subnational level, project-wise or otherwise, there's opportunities there that we can think. And that builds for the future in some sense.
That's great. Thanks, Debbie. So first question right here in the front with the scarf. Yes, please. No, that's you. Yes? Uh-huh.
Hi, I am Maheen, and I work for the water practice. I have 3 very brief comments. I look at this report as a very, very good springboard for raising this discussion, because this report primarily has an introspective perspective, which I really, really like. But one of the things that we need to look at is to provide the evidence to the TTL within the sectors. The sectoral aspect is very, very important. I love the ESAF framework, that it provides so much space for improving citizen engagement. But the thing is that you need to develop and convince and, convert the sectoral TTLs, the sectors within the social development specialists, the people working on governance are already converted. I mean, they know the meaning of citizen engagement. But what about the sectors? For sector TTLs, I mean, they don't have budget, nothing, and retrospectively fitting, and again, the corporate, the ticking of the box kind of thing, that always happens, because those sectoral TTLs, depend on social development specialists. Now, an SD specialist at one point has 14 to 13 projects in the country. How would that person be held accountable to know the political economy of that particular sector? So you need to really bring that discussion to the sector. The other thing I believe is that the most focus of a lot of World Bank publications and trainings and other aspects are on TTLs and on people who are working in the field. But I think managers should be also provided orientation on the importance of the subject and how to integrate it. One of the things that I love about this marriage of SUR and governance is that it works perfectly, because I am a strong believer of the fact that the civic engagement doesn't work until and unless it has an institutional space within the public sector, where the feedback can be processed and can be implemented, and that can only happen when you integrate, not just when you look at not just IPFs, but more and more we are moving towards P4Rs, and there is our opportunity to make that institutional change, that you create an institutional space where the citizens' feedback and citizens' input is processed and incorporated within the development agenda. So these are the 2 or 3 points.
That's
that
great,
I wanted
thank
to
you.
Thanks.
I think this first question about the silos between governance and the sectors is right in the strike zone for you, Anna. Do you want to respond there?
Yeah, I think there's 2 main, well, I fully agree with you that preaching to the choir is not effective, and I'm a governance person. I've been trying over the past year or 2 to work with sectoral experts in my organization to understand what their perspectives are on governance and how to better integrate between governance and sectoral approaches. And some of the motivators that we've come out of that seem to resonate, and I encourage you to explore further as you work with sectors, is one of them is around sustainability and demonstrating how governance approaches in general and citizen engagement is included under that can demonstrably contribute to sustainability of outcomes. We had one project, there's a USAID project in Jordan that there had been 60 years of USAID investment in water infrastructure, and the water technical team actually said, we're sick of this. We're sick of seeing broken pipes and no change in how water is delivered, and no better, water's not reaching farmers, not reaching consumers. What do we need to do? And they designed a whole project that started out with an institutional assessment and consultations with various stakeholders to set the agenda before any technical activities took place. So I think demonstrating that kind of responding to those frustrations that may be there in sectors with demonstrating sustainability is one of them. And the other one is how governance approaches can help with adaptation and flexibility that we were talking about earlier. We had one project in Nepal, actually, that faced constant change. I mean, political upheaval, earthquakes, embargoes from India, decentralization. And that project was a health systems project, and it was commended for its flexibility because it was working with community health councils at the very local level. And those councils provided information on how these changes might impact health service delivery. And so it made the project more flexible, and that provided, that actually helped health outcomes. So taking the sectoral perspective, demonstrating how it can have a concrete impact on sectoral outcomes, I think is the approach to take.
Yeah, so just to note, so the P4R instrument that was mentioned is really grounded in the notion of working with sectors to be able to understand and alleviate the bottlenecks. We have a cute little phrase that we use. We work a lot with the water sector. Yeah. We work on the plumbing, not the pipes. Yeah. And so we actually are increasingly working with both the hard sectors and now with the human capital project, the soft sectors, to really try to identify which are the critical governance constraints to achieving results. And increasingly in the services, citizen engagement is happening in all sorts of really cool ways. So using telephones, so the MAJI program is a famous one in Kenya, where the water infrastructure service provider basically gets all its information by feedback loops through a smartphone, and they are immediately able to address issues. So getting the synergies across identifying issues in sectors, using feedback mechanisms of different sorts to be able to not sweep things under the rug, as Ede said. It really can be transformative in terms of how we broaden out the impact of citizen engagement, but then governance more broadly in sectoral work.
Great, thank you. Stephanie in the back. Yeah, I think we need a microphone back there so people online can hear.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Amwaku with Accountability Council. Apologies, I have a cold, so I can't speak too loudly. I just want to thank you all for having this event, and it's so great to see the progress that the bank has made towards this agenda and seeing where it's going to go in the future. I just wanted to reiterate Nadia's point about the importance of the bank's independent accountability mechanism, the inspection panel, as a citizen engagement tool. And Ede, I really appreciated your story about the scariness of the 10,000 complaints and how you framed that as actually not a negative thing, but something that you can learn from. And I think it would be great for the bank to also model that in response to panel findings and panel activities, and really support a strong inspection panel as a citizen engagement tool. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. Daniel? Sorry, I thought your name was Daniel, is that right? Yes, please, in the jacket.
I'm Richard O'Sullivan. I'm a civil society economist, and when you talk about engagement in the civil society, it's always as the watchdog, the critic, the advisor, and which inevitably leads to a confrontational adversarial role, and we wonder why civil society space is being closed. And in fact, working with the healthcare group in Afghanistan, I had the deputy minister of public health said, I don't like talking to civil society, they only show up to complain and whine. But what I don't hear is civil society as part of the governance process, that actually taking responsibility and not just complaining about government services, but delivering it themselves. For example, the water issue that you mentioned in, I believe it was the Philippines, they resolved that by taking it, the utility was still the property of the local government, but they created a nonprofit co-op to actually manage it. And all of a sudden, when the P&M became transparent, water started flowing. And using civil society organizations not just as the critic of the government, which does lead to closing space, but by making them partners with the government, actually proves to be. I would have, when I first started this, I thought, well, the government's going to push back. Actually, the fact that civil society organizations were stepping up and taking responsibility was so novel. And I do point out, when you talk about empowerment, in French, it's responsabiliser. You aren't empowered until you take responsibility, and we aren't giving it to them.
Nadia, I think you're probably best placed to respond to this one around civil society partnerships with government.
Sure. I mean, I think that there are a number of incredible examples where civil society have been the main actor delivering the service that works best for their communities. Oxfam works a lot with civil society partners in the countries where we're operating. So we definitely see the value also of investing in local partners and selecting, designing, and implementing projects alongside them, with them, and for them. Just in terms of, the spectrum of civil society is an important point to note, that there are so many different aspects to civil society. And there are some civil society organizations whose mandate it is to do monitoring and accountability and working on that front. And then there's the broad majority of community-based organizations and organizations who don't have that capacity or mandate. Their role is to work on behalf of, and the other ones do too, but I mean, their role is to represent and work with the communities. And so, yeah, I think there is this misnomer about who civil society is, and that if we're engaging with civil society, we're going to be having to listen to complaints. And of course, that's not it. I also really appreciated your example, and it made me reflect on the fact that if there had been excellent stakeholder engagement from, the first step of that project, there would have been, instead of 200 complaints, probably much fewer complaints, because that's how you design a project that works, is working with people and getting their inputs from the beginning.
I'll just add one anecdote of a client who said, I really don't like this name, grievance redress mechanism. It's really bad. It sends the wrong signal that we're here to have complaints, and then change it to feedback provided mechanism into this process. And I think that signaling that it is a co-creation, that it is a participatory process and all that is an important dimension altogether. And I think that at the end, I fully agree that the inspection panel needs to be an integral part of all these mechanisms, but part of this, of citizen engagement, is to be able that bad things don't happen. Hopefully that the inspection panel never gets to hear anything into this process. That's, I think, to me, a sense of success at the project and the intervention level altogether.
That's great. Thank you.
Just quickly, I wanted to challenge you, Richard, a little bit to say that critiques from civil society is what's responsible for closing the space. I'm not sure that that's necessarily a safe assumption, but I would also say that confrontational citizen engagement at a very local level can actually be, it can be difficult and it can turn violent. That's terrible. But if it's facilitated, it can actually really help to open up some of those spaces and change processes and contribute to institutionalization of civic engagement.
I'm not saying that civil society should not be.
Yeah. No, I take your point that.
But it's the only tool in the box.
Yeah. No. But I think that it's sometimes, to get back to the thing about context, sometimes we try to find these conducive contexts for citizen engagement, and sometimes it can be those really more confrontational contexts where more progress can be made if you can get over that confrontational phase.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like we recognize that there are a variety of instruments that civil society can use to engage with the bank, and that goes for a variety of different civil society organizations with different roles. I saw a question here. Yes.
Different size. My name is Michel Estella. I work at ENR. I used to work at Civicus, the civic space monitor thing. 3 observations, if I'd be quick. On the role of civil society, I think we're talking about 2 things, and that one is with World Bank projects is we have twin goals, and the twin goals is to reach the poorest of the poorest and in a sustainable manner. Are we reaching them in the way we produce this? I think this is one mechanism in which you want to do that, and in that which you're talking more about participatory planning, etc., engaging the stakeholders, and particularly those stakeholders that are the poorest of the poor, in the design, in the delivery, in the monitoring, in the closure of the project. I think that's one role that I think is distinguishable from what you talk about is the civic space. Those 2 are not necessarily related at the hip. And that speaks to the role of civil society, which is often a kind of a stopgap phrase. We included civil society. And I mean, if you go to EITI mechanisms, that's transparency issues in natural resource management, particularly extractives. The debate is constantly about whether those represented in the mechanism are indeed civil society representatives or not, and particularly in cases like Ethiopia, where there is a debate about how big that civic space is. Then the last point, observation. How would you, what are your observations about the fact that civic space is shrinking, yet at the same time our tools and techniques, you mentioned Facebooks, and all the other social media and electricity and whatever, is increasing. So that's a bit ironic to an extent. How do you see that? Take it to me. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And just give the panel to respond very quickly. We're about to run out of time, and I want to give you each a minute to sort of close off the sessions.
We can incorporate this
That would be great. Yep.
So I think a really important development that we need to consider on this front is with the evolution of technology, the ability of individuals to engage, so disintermediated engagement is a different thing than intermediated engagement through CSOs. So CSOs will be a group of people that represent typically a perspective or a group. It is changing the way the world is working, and it's changing governance, and it's a completely unregulated space. And so one question for us is, how do we do that? Do we work with CSOs as groups? Do we go out to individuals and just have people chime in as they wish? How can you have confidence in what you're hearing and knowing with all that kind of stuff? So there's a huge agenda ahead. I think in my last 30 seconds or 10 seconds, whatever, I think we're very grateful to Elena and the IEG team for having done a great evaluation. We do actually like IEG evaluations, particularly when we are given an opportunity to engage. So a citizen, we are citizens sometimes too. It's a great evaluation. We've made inroads, but there's an awful lot that remains to be done, and it's a very complex topic. And so we thank you for being here, but we need to think about how, on the countryside, we take the findings and think about how to build them out further and do better as we go forward.
Great. Closing thoughts, Nadia?
Thanks. So in my closing comments, I want to show why these two issues of closing civic space and citizen engagement are so important to link together. During the annual meetings in Bali, I heard an IMF official say that there was no civil society discontent with the IMF loan program. Nobody told us anything that they didn't, nobody in Egypt, no civil society told us they didn't like the program in Egypt. And I was just baffled by the fact that there is no civic space. I mean, there are so many countries in which we're all operating as development actors, where there is such tight civic space for communities to stand up and to protest about, for media to be free enough to say anything. I mean, so many governments we know where the media actually, every newspaper has to go through and be checked by government. I mean, this is the reality of the countries in which you're operating. So if you want to then do stakeholder engagement and genuine stakeholder engagement, you better know what limitations you're operating in. And so it really is important. And I would totally agree with you that 4 to 6 years is way too long of a period to assess that civic space. Things are changing quickly, especially now with the rise of populist governments. And so I really would, if you can do it yearly, that would be great. And you should be doing it at the project level and at the sectoral level too.
Great, thanks, Nadia. Ede, you want to close off?
I'll conclude with an invitation for all of you from civil society to join us in this journey. I think that there's so much that we don't know, and there's so much learning that is going to happen with this wealth of mechanisms to be tested. There's so much that we need to learn on how to do good stakeholder engagement plans, what is good quality. We are taking the first few steps in this direction, and we really invite you to continue being our partners and deepening the partnership at the global and local level to move into this direction.
Well, I'm just going to close with saying I thought that this was a really encouraging discussion. I think I really applaud the evaluation in general for being so honest and forthright, but constructive, and that the work that we're all describing here, it sounds like a lot, but it's the fact that it's so collaborative and so open, I think is a real step in the right direction. So thanks everyone for that.
Great, so that's a step in the right direction. It sounds like we still have some work to do, especially around improving quality and improving the incentives around citizen engagement. We know that civic space is very closely linked to this agenda. It is the bank's business, and that the bank is willing to spend its political capital on this issue. And then finally, an invitation to make sure that we get this stuff done. I know that the management action plan is due in mid-January. I saw you all scribbling there on your pads. I can only assume that that's the draft based on the feedback from our citizens. And we look forward to being with you all again soon. Thanks, everybody.